On the day my husband passed away, I didn't mention the $28 million inheritance or the skyscraper in New York City registered in my name. That same evening, my daughter-in-law shouted, "Pack your bags. The old leech doesn't stay here." I simply replied, "Okay." Then I chose to take a step I'm glad I did. Stay with me until the end and share the city you're watching from. I'd like to see how far this story reaches. My name is Alberta, and I'm 64 years old. On the day my husband Richard died, I believed the greatest pain I could feel was losing the man I had loved for 38 years. I was mistaken. The real pain arrived 12 hours later, when his own family showed me exactly how little they valued me. The funeral was everything Richard would have wanted: dignified, respectful, and attended by people whose lives he had influenced. I sat in the front pew wearing my navy dress, the one he always said highlighted my eyes, holding myself together as best as I could. People whispered about what a devoted wife I had been, how I had cared for him during his final months without complaint. If only they knew the full story. Richard's son Marcus, from his first marriage, delivered a touching eulogy. His daughter Sarah read a poem. Even his ex-wife Patricia managed to say something kind about the man who had left her 20 years ago for me. I listened quietly, nodding when appropriate, accepting condolences with calm composure. It seemed everyone forgot that I wasn't just the second wife, I was the widow. The reception afterward took place at our home, or rather, what everyone believed was our home. I watched as relatives I barely recognized flip through photo albums while distant cousins silently estimated the value of our furniture. Sarah's husband James asked pointed questions about Richard's business, and Marcus's wife Jennifer commented on how valuable the house must be. But it was Cynthia, Richard's youngest son, David's wife, who drew my attention. She had married into the family only 3 years ago and had made it clear from the beginning that she saw me as an outsider. She assumed I had married Richard for his money, without ever understanding the truth about his wealth or its origins. Throughout the day, she watched me carefully, exchanging whispers with Sarah when I stepped away, and offering cold smiles whenever I paused to rest. The last guest left around 8:30. I stood in the kitchen, loading the dishwasher with unsteady hands when I heard slow, deliberate footsteps behind me. They stopped at the entrance. "Well, that's done," Cynthia said. I didn't turn. I continued placing dishes inside, focusing on the task to steady myself. "Thank you for helping organize everything," I said softly. Richard would have appreciated it. "Stop pretending, Alberta," she replied sharply. I turned to face her. She stood with her arms crossed, still in black, but no longer pretending to grieve. Behind her, David shifted awkwardly, while Sarah and Marcus stood nearby, forming what felt like a silent panel. "I'm sorry?" I said. Cynthia stepped closer. "You can drop the Grieving Widow Act. We need to discuss practical matters." My hands paused. "What practical matters?" "This house, Richard's assets, the family business," she said slowly. "David and I have spoken with Marcus and Sarah. We think it's best if you start looking for another place." The room seemed to tilt. "Another place?" Sarah cleared her throat. "What Cynthia means is that the house is too large for one person, and the maintenance costs alone." "Are you asking me to leave?" I interrupted quietly. Cynthia smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "I'm asking you to be realistic. You're 64, Alberta. Richard supported you while he was alive, but now it's time to downsize and find something more suitable." "My situation? Well, you never worked, did you? Richard provided everything, this house, your lifestyle, your security, but it was his success, his money." She gestured around the kitchen as if it already belonged to her. "The family needs to make decisions about his estate." A cold feeling settled inside me. "This is my home. I've lived here for 15 years. And it's been lovely," Marcus added, finally speaking. "But Dad would want us to think practically. There are 4 of us children, plus grandchildren. There are future expenses to consider." "Richard left a will," I said. "Yes, and we'll respect whatever small portion he left you," Cynthia replied dismissively. "But let's be honest, you were his second wife, not his partner in business. You didn't build anything, you were just there." Those words landed heavily. Just there. After 38 years, after standing by him through illness, after building a life together, I was reduced to that. "I think you should pack tonight," Cynthia continued. David and I can stay here to manage everything. It will be easier if we take control of Richard's affairs." I looked at David, silently asking for support, but he avoided my gaze. "Where am I supposed to go?" Cynthia shrugged. "There are good senior communities nearby, assisted living facilities. I'm sure you'll find something appropriate." Assisted living, spoken as if I were incapable of caring for myself. I stood in my own kitchen, surrounded by people I once considered family, and felt something break beyond grief. Losing Richard was painful, but this was betrayal. This was being erased. Yet as I looked at them, at Cynthia's satisfaction and the others' uneasy agreement, something else began to grow within me. Something calm and controlled. "Okay," I said. Cynthia blinked. "Okay. I'll pack tonight. I'll leave in the morning." The silence that followed was striking. They had expected resistance, perhaps even a scene. Instead, I turned back to the dishwasher and continued my work. "Well," Cynthia said, unsettled, "that's mature of you." I didn't reply. I simply listened as they walked away, their voices lowering as they began discussing plans for the house. They believed they were removing a burden, claiming what was theirs. They saw Richard's widow as an elderly woman with no options. They were mistaken. As I closed the dishwasher and heard it begin its cycle, I allowed myself a faint smile. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of something new, for me. For them, it would be far more complicated. That night, I packed only 2 suitcases. I left everything else behind. The jewelry, artwork, and designer clothing Cynthia was likely already imagining as hers. Let them believe I was leaving with nothing but memories. The Hampton Inn on Route 1 became my temporary residence. It wasn't luxurious, but it offered privacy, reliable internet, and anonymity. I checked in under my maiden name, Alberta Morrison, and paid cash. The clerk barely noticed me, just another older woman traveling alone. That invisibility suited me perfectly. My first call was to Harold Steinberg. He had been Richard's lawyer for 25 years and mine for the last 15, though no one in the family knew that. "Alberta," he said warmly, "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you, Harold. I need to meet tomorrow." "Of course, 10 o'clock. "Somewhere private," I added. There was a brief pause. "The family is causing trouble?" "You could say that. I'll come to you." The next morning, Harold arrived carrying his briefcase, his expression calm but knowing. I explained everything. The confrontation, Cynthia's demands, the assumption that I had contributed nothing. "Do they know your real situation?" he asked. "Not at all," I replied. "We agreed long ago to keep it that way." "And you want to proceed?" "I do." Harold opened his file. "Initial transfers can be completed within 48 hours. Full restructuring will take about 2 weeks. Legally, everything has been yours for over a decade. Richard arranged it years ago." I nodded. "And the house?" He allowed a slight smile. "Technically, you could remove them immediately, but I assume you have a different plan." "I do. I want them comfortable. I want them to reveal themselves fully. Then I'll remind them how wrong they are." After he left, I drove past the house, my house, and watched from across the street. Moving trucks were already there. Cynthia directed workers confidently, as if she owned the place. She had even brought her own furniture. My phone buzzed. A message from David. "Hope you found somewhere nice. Cynthia is organizing Dad's office. We found some business files." I almost laughed. If only they knew, the real documents weren't in that house at all. They were secured elsewhere along with the evidence that would soon change everything. But let them go through his desk drawers and filing cabinets. Let them discover his appointment books and client lists from the small consulting firm everyone believed was our only income source. Let them estimate modest assets and plan for modest inheritances. The reality would be far more impactful when it surfaced. I drove downtown and spent the afternoon at First National, where I maintained accounts they knew nothing about. Margaret Chen, my personal banker, welcomed me with professional sympathy. "Mrs. Morrison, I was very sorry to hear about your husband's passing. How are you managing?" "As well as can be expected. I need to make some adjustments to my accounts." Margaret nodded, likely assuming I needed to update beneficiary details or survivor benefits. Instead, I handed her Harold's documents. Her expression shifted as she reviewed them. "Mrs. Morrison, these figures. I had no idea you were handling assets of this scale. Privacy was important to my husband and me, but circumstances have changed. I understand. When would you like these transfers to take effect?" immediately. As Margaret processed the paperwork, I thought about Cynthia at the house, likely sorting through my belongings and deciding what she intended to keep. I thought about Marcus and Sarah, probably consulting financial advisors about their father's estate. And I thought about David, silent, passive David, who had allowed his wife to confront the person who had raised him. They believed I was gone, that the inconvenient widow had stepped aside, leaving them free to claim what they assumed was theirs. They didn't realize they were dealing with someone who had spent 38 years understanding patience and long-term planning. My phone rang as I signed the final transfer documents. Cynthia's name appeared on the screen. I let it go to voicemail and listened afterward with quiet amusement. Alberta, we found some confusing paperwork in Richard's office, legal documents that don't make sense. Could you call me back? There may be things you need to clarify. Confusing paperwork. I could imagine what they had found. Likely outdated copies Richard kept for appearance, referencing assets no longer under his name. They were beginning to question what they thought they understood. I deleted the message without replying. Let them question it. Let them worry. Let them spend time trying to understand why nothing aligned with their expectations. The next phase of my plan would begin tomorrow. That evening, I had dinner in my hotel room and watched the news like any other older woman spending a quiet night alone. But I wasn't alone. Not really. I had Harold. I had Margaret. I had professionals who'd been managing my affairs discreetly for years. Most importantly, I had time. Cynthia and the others believed they had achieved a quick outcome. They didn't realize they had challenged someone who had been preparing for this moment long before they entered the family. The grieving widow phase was over. It was time for Alberta Morrison to step forward, and when she did, they would understand that assumptions carry consequences. 3 days passed at the Hampton Inn, and it became clear the family was growing uneasy. My phone filled with increasingly urgent messages from Cynthia, each more insistent than the last. She wanted me to return and explain inconsistencies in Richard's records. She needed signatures. She had questions only I could answer. I ignored them all. Instead, I spent my mornings in the hotel's business center, making calls that would have surprised them. On Tuesday, I spoke with the property management firm overseeing my 3 apartment complexes in Manhattan. On Wednesday, I held a conference call with my investment advisor about reallocating certain assets. On Thursday, I spent 2 hours discussing renovation plans with architects for a building I owned in Soho. My quiet investment. One even Richard hadn't fully recognized when I purchased it 15 years earlier using funds from my first marriage. At the time, it had been an overlooked warehouse in an area few valued. Now it was worth $28 million, and the income from the high-end lofts exceeded what Richard's consulting firm earned in a year. None of them knew any of this. To them, I was still the second wife who had never worked. On Friday morning, Harold called with information that brought a rare sense of satisfaction. "They've hired an attorney," he said. "Have they?" "Jackson Morrison from Morrison & Associates. No relation to you, I assume." "None. What does he want?" "He's asking questions about Richard's estate, that the family has concerns about how assets are being handled." I set my coffee down, feeling a calm certainty settle in. How appropriate. "There's more. They've requested a formal reading of the will. All beneficiaries are expected to attend, including you." "When?" "Monday at 2 p.m. at their attorney's office." "Perfect. I'll be there." "Alberta, once this begins, there's no reversing it. They'll learn everything." I looked out the window at the ordinary world beyond, people occupied with routine concerns. Soon, I would no longer be invisible to the family that had underestimated me. I've been ready for this for 15 years. That weekend, I went shopping, not at discount stores as they might have expected, but at the boutiques I had always preferred. I selected a navy suit, simple, refined, along with my grandmother's pearl necklace and the Cartier watch Richard had given me for our 10th anniversary. I intended to present myself exactly as I was, composed, capable, and fully aware of my position. On Sunday evening, I checked out of the Hampton Inn and spent one night in the penthouse suite at the Fairmont downtown, not out of necessity, but as a reminder of my reality before the meeting. I ordered room service, lobster and champagne, and reviewed the documents Harold had prepared. Everything was precise. Everything was legal. Everything was ready. Monday morning arrived gray and overcast, matching the tone of the day ahead. I dressed carefully, applied my makeup with attention to detail, and arrived at Morrison & Associates 15 minutes early. The receptionist, a young woman, looked at me with mild dismissal. "You're here for the estate reading?" she asked. "I am. Alberta Morrison, the widow." Something in my voice made her pause, but before she could respond, raised voices echoed from down the hallway. "This is unnecessary," Cynthia was saying. "Why does she need to be here? She isn't a real beneficiary." "The law requires all named parties to attend," a man replied, likely their attorney. "She didn't contribute to the estate," Marcus added. "Our father supported her. Regardless, she has legal standing as the surviving spouse." I listened as they discussed me as though I were an inconvenience. The receptionist glanced at me, uncertain how I might react. I remained seated, calm and composed, appearing exactly as they expected, quiet, unremarkable, and easily overlooked. At precisely 2, Harold arrived, acknowledging me with professional formality. With him was a woman I hadn't met before, tall, composed, and clearly authoritative. "Mrs. Morrison," Harold said, "this is Catherine Walsh. She will represent your interests today." Catherine extended her hand with a polite, controlled smile. "Mrs. Morrison, I've been briefed on your situation." Before I could respond, Jackson Morrison entered. He was a mild-mannered man in his 50s who appeared somewhat overwhelmed by the situation he had been hired to handle. "Well," he said, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief, "I believe everyone is here. Shall we begin?" The conference room was larger than necessary, with a polished table that could easily seat 20 people. The family had positioned themselves on one side as if preparing for a formal dispute. Cynthia sat at the head, with David and Sarah beside her, and Marcus slightly behind them in support. They were dressed professionally, expensive suits, confident posture, carrying the expectation of inheriting everything. I took a seat directly across from them, with Harold and Catherine seated on either side of me. The arrangement was clear to everyone present. Jackson Morrison cleared his throat and began reading Richard's will in a steady, practiced tone. He covered the standard legal language, statements of sound mind, formal declarations, and initial charitable contributions. Then he reached the section they had been waiting for. "To my children, Marcus, Sarah, and David, I leave the sum of $50,000 each, to be divided equally among them." I observed their reactions carefully. While $50,000 was a significant amount in many cases, it was far below what they had anticipated. Cynthia's expression tightened slightly. Sarah looked unsettled. Marcus leaned forward as if questioning what he had heard. "And to my wife, Alberta Morrison Holloway, I leave the remainder of my estate, including all properties, investments, and business interests, to be hers in full and without restriction." The room fell silent. Jackson continued reading, but it was clear no one was listening anymore. All attention had shifted to me, with expressions ranging from confusion to disbelief. "Excuse me," Cynthia interrupted sharply. "Could you repeat that last part?" Jackson hesitated. "The majority of Mr. Holloway's estate is assigned to his widow, which is standard in such cases." "What exactly does that include?" Sarah asked, her voice rising. "The house? The business?" Catherine Walsh responded calmly, referring to her copy of the will. "According to the document, Mrs. Morrison inherits all real estate, financial accounts, business assets, and personal property not otherwise specified." "That's not possible," Marcus said firmly. "Our father wouldn't leave us with only $50,000 each." Harold leaned forward slightly. "It is entirely valid, Mr. Holloway. Your father was very clear in his instructions." "But she didn't earn any of it," Cynthia said, losing her composure. "She never worked. She didn't contribute. She was simply there, living off his success." Her words echoed in the room, familiar, dismissive, and based on a complete misunderstanding. I stood slowly, aware that all attention was now on me. For decades, I had allowed Richard to represent our public success while I remained in the background. That approach had served its purpose. Now circumstances had changed. "You're correct, Cynthia," I said evenly. "I did not contribute to Richard's consulting firm, his investments, or his professional reputation. Those were his achievements." They looked at me with visible confusion, not expecting agreement. "However," I continued, Richard's estate is not what you believe it to be, and I am not who you assume I am. Catherine was already opening her briefcase, removing documents that had been prepared in advance. Harold checked his watch, ensuring everything aligned as planned. "What do you mean?" David asked, speaking for the first time. I looked at each of them in turn. The same people who had dismissed me and removed me from my own home. "It means," I said calmly, "that you have been operating under incorrect assumptions about ownership in this family." Catherine opened a folder with precision, placing the documents on the table. "Perhaps we should clarify what actually constitutes Richard Holloway's estate." Jackson shifted slightly. "I'm not sure I follow." "The question," Harold explained, "is whether Richard owned the assets you believe he did." Cynthia's confidence began to fade. "Of course he did. The house, the business, everything." "That is incorrect," Catherine replied, sliding the first document forward. "Mrs. Morrison has been the primary owner of nearly all major assets for more than 15 years. The document came to rest in front of Cynthia. She hesitated before picking it up. "This is the deed to the property at 47 Elm Street," Catherine continued. "The residence you are currently occupying. Please note the registered owner." Cynthia's expression changed as she read. "Alberta Morrison?" she said quietly. "That is correct," Catherine confirmed. Ownership was transferred to Mrs. Morrison in 2008. Mr. Holloway retained lifetime occupancy rights, but full ownership remained with her. Sarah took the document, scanning it quickly. "This must be an error. He purchased that house before meeting her." "He did," Harold replied. "However, he refinanced the property in 2007 using capital provided by Mrs. Morrison. As a result, ownership was reassigned to her as the primary financial contributor." "What capital?" Marcus asked. "She never had money." Catherine maintained a composed expression. "Mrs. Morrison has held substantial assets since before her marriage. She simply chose not to publicize them." I spoke again calmly. "Those funds came from my first marriage. When my first husband passed away in 1995, I inherited significant assets, real estate, investments, and insurance. I was financially independent long before I met Richard." The room remained silent. "But you never worked," David said, uncertain. "I didn't need traditional employment," I replied. "I managed investments, acquired and sold properties, and made financial decisions independently." I gestured toward Catherine, who was already preparing the next set of documents. "I simply chose to do it without attention." Catherine placed another folder on the table, continuing the process. "These are the ownership documents for Morrison Holdings, LLC, established in 1996. Mrs. Morrison is the sole proprietor of a company that owns 17 properties across 3 states. Cynthia reacted immediately. 17 properties? Including 3 apartment complexes in Manhattan, 2 office buildings in Boston, and a renovated warehouse in Soho, recently valued at $28 million. The figure had a noticeable impact on the room. I watched as their understanding began to shift. $28 million? Sarah said quietly. That's just one property, Harold added. Would you like to review the full portfolio? He didn't wait for a reply. One document after another was placed on the table. Bank statements showing balances far exceeding anything they had expected, investment records detailing stock holdings, and property deeds across multiple states. The total value of Mrs. Morrison's holdings, Catherine said, reviewing her summary, is approximately $47 million, excluding the assets inherited from Mr. Holloway's estate, which amount to roughly $300,000. $47 million. The number settled heavily in the room. Cynthia looked at me differently now, no longer just surprised, but unsettled. You're not being truthful, she said, though without confidence. Which part concerns you? I asked calmly. That I was financially independent before meeting Richard, or that you've been living in my house for the past week? But why didn't Richard say anything? Marcus asked. Because I asked him not to, I replied. He valued the image of being the provider. I allowed that publicly while managing matters privately. David spoke slowly. So when we told you to leave? You were asking me to leave my own home, I said. The realization was becoming clear to them. The business materials you found in Richard's office, Catherine continued, relate to a consulting firm that generated approximately $40,000 annually. It was not the primary source of income you assumed. Then how was everything paid for? Sarah asked. It wasn't, I said. I covered the mortgage, taxes, utilities, and insurance. Richard's income handled smaller expenses. Cynthia's composure began to falter. You let us believe. I allowed you to demonstrate your assumptions, I corrected. I did not ask you to remove me from my home or speak to me with disrespect. Those were your choices. The room remained quiet. I gave you the opportunity to act differently, I added. Instead, you made your position clear. Jackson Morrison looked uncertain. There seems to be confusion about these assets. There is no confusion, Harold said. All documentation is valid and has been in place for years. Mrs. Morrison was not required to disclose her finances. Marcus spoke again, more cautiously. What does this mean for us? Catherine answered directly. You receive what is outlined in the will, $50,000 each. Regarding your current situation, you are residing in Mrs. Morrison's property without permission, which legally qualifies as trespassing. The word had an immediate effect. That can't be serious, Cynthia said quietly. It is, I replied, standing. You asked me to leave so you could take what you believed was yours. However, those assumptions were incorrect. I gathered my belongings and looked at each of them. You have 72 hours to remove your possessions from my property, I said. After that, I will proceed with legal action. As I moved toward the door, Cynthia called out, her tone urgent. Alberta, we can resolve this. We're family. I paused briefly. Family, I repeated. You've already shown me what that means to you. I left the room knowing that chapter was closed. The situation had shifted permanently. The 72 hours that followed were not about satisfaction, but about clarity. For the first time, people were facing the consequences of their decisions. Cynthia called 6 hours later. Her tone was controlled but strained. Alberta, we need to discuss this. Things have escalated. I believe everything was addressed earlier, I replied. You understand what I mean. The house, the finances. There must be a reasonable solution. Reasonable? I said. Like asking me to leave my home the night of my husband's funeral? There was a pause. We were grieving, she said. You were decisive enough to act quickly, I responded. You began dividing assets immediately. But we're family. No, I said. You made it clear that I was not. I ended the call and did not continue the conversation. The next morning, David came to see me. He sat across from me in the hotel lobby, visibly uncomfortable. Alberta, I'm sorry, he said. You had the opportunity to act differently, I replied. I regret it. We thought everything would be shared. We believed we were entitled. And your response was to remove me? He hesitated. We thought it would be better for you. Be honest, I said. You wanted full control. He looked down. You allowed it to happen, I continued. You could have intervened. I know, he said. This is not about regret, I added. It's about accountability. He nodded, understanding. I will proceed as planned, I said. You have until tomorrow evening to leave. After that, the locks will be changed. He accepted it without argument. By Friday evening, I returned to the house. The driveway was full, indicating a gathering. I entered using my key. The conversation inside stopped immediately. They were seated together as if discussing next steps. Cynthia stood when she saw me. We were hoping to discuss a settlement, she said. A settlement? I asked. For what? For the house. We've invested time and effort into it. You're referring to 1 week of occupancy? I replied. 2 unfamiliar individuals were present. They introduced themselves as Cynthia's parents. I hope you've been given accurate information, I said. They appeared uncertain. The situation is straightforward, I explained. The will is clear, the property belongs to me, and it always has. They exchanged looks as the details became clear. You never worked, Cynthia's mother said. I managed investments, I replied. Approximately $47 million in assets. The silence that followed spoke for itself. When your daughter asked me to leave, I continued, she was asking me to leave my own property. Cynthia's parents reacted with visible concern. If that is accurate, her father said, then we owe you an apology. They chose to leave shortly afterward, distancing themselves from the situation. 20 minutes, I said to the room. Please complete your departure. They complied without further argument. When the last vehicle left, I contacted Harold. It's finished, I said. How do you feel? He asked. Relieved, I answered. 6 months later, I was in my garden when I received a call from a hospital. David had been in an accident and listed me as his emergency contact. I went to see him. He was stable but shaken. "I'm sorry," he said. "I understand," I replied. He explained that his marriage had ended and acknowledged his mistakes. "I knew what happened was wrong," he said. "I should have acted differently." I listened. "You raised me," he added. "I failed you." I held his hand. "You made a mistake," I said. "That doesn't define everything." We spoke about what had happened and what it meant. "That night showed me something important," I said.